January 17th, 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The air smelled of salt water and scorched earth. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita stood beneath the canopy of a makeshift command post in the mountains north of Manila, his hands pressed flat against a wooden table scarred by hasty pencil marks and the weight of impossible decisions. Through the dense jungle foliage he could hear it, a distant rumble that never ceased, like thunder trapped in an endless loop. American artillery. The sound had become so constant over the past weeks that his staff no longer flinched. They had learned to live inside the roar, to speak over it, to sleep beneath it. But Yamashita did not sleep anymore. He listened. And in that listening he understood what his superiors in Tokyo refused to acknowledge, that Japan had not prepared for this kind of war, not this abundance, not this mechanical fury that turned entire hillsides into churning dust. In the failing light, he reviewed the reports once more. Ammunition expenditures, casualty estimates, requests for reinforcements that would never come. The numbers told a story his training had not equipped him to interpret. The Americans were not simply winning. They were operating on a scale that rendered traditional military calculus obsolete. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized spirit, discipline, and the willingness to die, American doctrine emphasized something far more unsettling: the willingness to waste, to expend, to pour forth resources as though the supply were infinite. And perhaps, Yamashita thought grimly, it was. This was not the war Japan's generals had envisioned when they struck Pearl Harbor 4 years earlier. In those heady days of late 1941, the architects of Japanese expansion had built their strategy on a foundation of calculated assumptions. They believed the Americans were soft, a nation grown fat on luxury, unwilling to endure prolonged sacrifice. They believed American industrial capacity, while impressive, could be neutralized through swift, decisive victories that would seize resource-rich territories and establish a defensive perimeter too costly to breach. They believed, most fatally, that willpower and martial spirit could compensate for material disadvantage. Bushido against assembly lines, the soul of the warrior against the soullessness of mass production. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned them. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he reportedly said. But even Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, could not have fully grasped the nature of the beast they had provoked. He understood American industrial capacity in theory. He had seen the factories, the automobiles, the steel mills, but understanding statistics on paper and experiencing their translation into military power were different orders of knowledge entirely. One was academic, the other was apocalyptic. The first tremors of that apocalypse reached Japanese commanders not as a single revelation, but as an accumulating dread. In the early months of the war, victory had come easily. Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, each fell like dominoes before the disciplined fury of Japanese arms. But even in triumph, observant officers noticed troubling details. The equipment captured from retreating American and Filipino forces on Bataan was of a quality and quantity that seemed almost wasteful. Trucks abandoned with half-full fuel tanks. Ammunition dumps destroyed rather than defended. Rations left behind that Japanese soldiers, subsisting on rice and dried fish, consumed with wondering disbelief. Canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes in colorful packages. These were not the supplies of an army in desperate retreat. These were the discarded excess of an army that could afford to leave things behind. Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines during the initial invasion, wrote in his diary of the disturbing abundance, evident even in defeat. The enemy fights poorly, he noted, but his logistics suggest reserves we have not accounted for. Every American soldier carries more ammunition than our company officers. Their medical supplies are lavish to the point of decadence. What manner of nation equips its common infantry with such wealth? The answer came slowly, delivered in increments of steel and fire. By 1943, as American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, Japanese commanders found themselves confronting a new and terrifying arithmetic. At Tarawa, a tiny atoll that should have been held indefinitely by its fortified garrison, American forces expended more naval shells in a single preliminary bombardment than the entire Japanese Navy had allocated for the defense. The coral atoll was pounded by battleship guns for hours, an expenditure of ordnance that seemed to defy economic logic. How could any nation afford such extravagance? And if they could afford it here, on this insignificant speck of coral, what would they bring to bear on larger, more strategic targets? The answer was more, always more. At Saipan in June 1944, the American pre-invasion bombardment lasted for days. Naval artillery, carrier-based aircraft and long-range bombers worked in orchestrated rotation, turning defensive positions into moonscapes. Japanese commanders, huddled in caves and bunkers, tried to count the explosions and gave up. There was no point. The shells fell like rain in a typhoon, individually indistinct, collectively overwhelming. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the defense, sent increasingly desperate messages to Tokyo. The enemy's firepower is beyond anything in our experience. A single American division employs more artillery than our entire army group. They do not probe for weakness, they simply obliterate the terrain. But it was not merely the quantity, it was the casualness, the ease. Japanese soldiers who survived the bombardments and lived to face American infantry attacks reported something more psychologically devastating than the firepower itself, the attitude of those wielding it. American soldiers did not charge with suicidal determination, seeking glorious death. They advanced methodically, almost slowly, behind rolling barrages of artillery fire. When they encountered resistance, they did not hurl themselves forward. They stopped, called for support, and within minutes, sometimes seconds, mortars, artillery, naval guns, or aircraft would answer. The Americans fought as though ammunition were a renewable resource, as though every ridge and bunker could be purchased with shells rather than blood. And they were right. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, tasked with defending Iwo Jima, understood the mathematics better than most. A thoughtful officer who had traveled extensively in the United States before the war, Kuribayashi had toured American factories and cities. He had seen Detroit's automobile plants, watched the assembly lines produce cars by the thousands. He knew what those same lines could produce when retooled for war. On Iwo Jima, he forbade banzai charges. He ordered his troops to dig deep, to fortify every cave and tunnel, to sell each meter of ground as dearly as possible, not because he believed they could win, but because he understood that the only metric that mattered anymore was time. The Americans would take Iwo Jima. The only question was how long it would take and how many resources they would expend doing it. The answer was 36 days and an almost incomprehensible expenditure of munitions. American forces fired over 450,000 artillery shells at an island 8 square miles in size. Carrier aircraft flew more than 8,000 sorties. Naval guns added another layer of destruction. By the time American boots touched volcanic sand, much of Iwo Jima's surface had been reshaped by explosives, and still the Japanese fought from tunnels and caves, extracting the highest possible cost. But even in their desperate effectiveness, Kuribayashi's men learned the lesson their general already knew. American abundance was not a temporary advantage to be weathered. It was a permanent condition, a strategic reality that no amount of Japanese courage could overcome. The symbolic weight of this disparity found its emblem in the simplest of objects, the ration can. To Japanese soldiers, whose diet often consisted of rice supplemented by foraged roots and whatever fish or game could be scavenged, the contents of a captured American K ration were almost incomprehensible. Canned meat, biscuits, chocolate bars, coffee, cigarettes, chewing gum, and not as special luxuries for officers, but as standard issue for every American soldier, every day. A Japanese infantry company might receive one hot meal per week if supply lines held. American soldiers complained if their ice cream was delayed. This was not merely a matter of comfort, it was a strategic statement, a declaration written in calories and steel. We can afford to fight this way. We can afford to feed our soldiers well, to keep them healthy and strong, to expend ammunition freely, to replace equipment casually. The Japanese soldier was taught that suffering purified the warrior spirit, that privation built character, that endurance in the face of hardship was itself a form of victory. The American soldier was taught that good logistics won wars. Both were right in their way, but only one philosophy could be sustained across years of global conflict. By 1945, as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands, the testimonies of Japanese generals took on a tone of grim revelation. These were not men given to panic or exaggeration. They were professional officers, many of them veterans of years of combat. Yet their reports read like encounters with something beyond their conceptual framework. General Tadashi Katakura, interrogated after Japan's surrender, was asked what surprised him most about American military capability. His answer was immediate. The artillery. We knew you had more guns. We did not understand that you would fire them so freely. In the Japanese army, every shell was precious, to be used only when essential. American forces seemed to have no such concerns. They fired at suspected positions, at possible threats, at nothing, simply to deny us rest. The noise alone was a weapon. The expenditure seemed insane, but it was not insanity. It was abundance turned into strategy. Another captured general, whose name was redacted in declassified interrogation reports, offered a more philosophical observation. You cannot fight American firepower with Japanese spirit. This is not cowardice on our part or exceptional courage on theirs. It is mathematics. They bring 10 shells for every one of ours, 100 bombs for every 10. When we destroy one tank, 2 more appear. When we shoot down one aircraft, 5 more take its place. This is not war as we understood it. This is industrial production applied to human destruction, and we had no doctrine to counter it. The transformation these encounters wrought on Japanese military thinking was profound and irreversible. Officers who survived the war and later wrote memoirs returned again and again to the theme of miscalculation, not of American courage, which they had never doubted, but of American capacity. They had confused material abundance with spiritual weakness, luxury with decadence, industrial efficiency with lack of warrior virtue. They had believed that a nation which valued individual life over collective sacrifice could not sustain the brutality of total war. They were wrong. The Americans valued individual life so highly that they built systems to protect it, systems of overwhelming firepower that substituted steel for flesh, machines for men, industrial might for human sacrifice. It was not weakness. It was a different kind of strength, one their Bushido-centered worldview had no framework to comprehend. The psychological impact rippled beyond military strategy into questions of ideology. If American abundance could produce such military power, what did that suggest about American democracy? If a system that allowed labor unions, free speech, and individual liberty could outproduce a militarized totalitarian state dedicated entirely to war production, what did that imply about the superiority of the Japanese model? These were dangerous questions, rarely articulated openly even in defeat, but they lived in the silences of interrogation transcripts, in the pauses between a general's carefully chosen words. The recurring symbol that haunted these testimonies was sound, the endless, grinding roar of American artillery. It appears in diary entries, interrogation reports, and post-war memoirs with almost obsessive frequency. For soldiers who survived months in the Pacific theater, that sound became the acoustic signature of American power. It was not the crack of individual rifle fire which speaks of personal combat, soldier against soldier. It was the rumble of industrialized destruction, impersonal and inexhaustible. You could not fight a sound, you could not bayonet a barrage, you could only endure it and eventually, inevitably, be buried by it. In the mountains north of Manila, as American forces tightened their encirclement in early 1945, General Yamashita issued his final orders. There would be no surrender, no negotiation. His troops would fight to the last, not because victory was possible, but because duty demanded it. Yet in the quiet moments between artillery barrages, he allowed himself to reflect on what this war had revealed. Japan had been strong, its soldiers brave, its pilots skilled, its admirals bold. But strength, bravery, skill, and boldness had proven insufficient against an enemy who could afford to be patient, methodical, and overwhelmingly superior in material. The Americans had not won through samurai spirit. They had won through assembly lines and supply chains, through a political system that could mobilize an entire continent's resources without collapsing into tyranny or starvation. When the war ended in August 1945, the testimonies of captured Japanese generals were compiled, translated, and studied by American military intelligence. The documents revealed not an enemy who had underestimated American courage, but one who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American power. They had prepared for a clash of wills. They encountered a clash of industrial capacities. They had trained for a short, decisive war of maneuver and spirit. They endured a long, grinding war of attrition and logistics. And in that crucible, the mythology of Bushido met the reality of Detroit, and only one survived. The lesson was written not in philosophy but in shell casings, in the millions of tons of ammunition expended, in the thousands of ships built and tanks produced and aircraft assembled. American firepower was not merely a tactical advantage, it was the physical manifestation of a political and economic system that could harness individual liberty and collective purpose simultaneously, that could ask citizens to sacrifice without demanding they surrender their humanity, that could wage total war without becoming totalitarian. It was, in the end, the firepower of a free people, abundant, overwhelming, and unleashed too late for those who underestimated what freedom could forge when threatened. And in that truth lies the haunting epilogue of those Japanese generals who finally understood in defeat what they had truly faced. Not just an army, but an arsenal. Not just soldiers, but a civilization at war with itself, disciplined into terrible unity. The roar they heard was not merely artillery, it was the sound of democracy, given voice through steel.